This is the best you could give me?
What a piece of junk! Ah!
200 guests burst into laughter as Ethan Carter raised his glass of champagne, pointing across the ballroom at a woman in a simple gray dress standing quietly near the entrance. Her name was Amara Brooks, and she had come carrying a small wrapped box, nothing more. "Is this really the birthday gift you brought me? A cheap little watch?" Ethan's voice rang out over the microphone, dripping with mockery, and the room answered him with cruel amusement. He hurled the box to the marble floor, the sound of it cracking against stone, louder than it should have been, and then he snapped his fingers at security, ordering them to escort her out of his own birthday celebration. Amara did not cry. She did not raise her voice or beg for dignity in front of 200 strangers. She simply bent down, picked up the broken box with steady hands, turned on her heel, and walked toward the door with her spine straight and her chin level. And it was exactly then, as she reached the threshold, that the tall doors of the ballroom swung open from the outside, and the laughter died in an instant. A line of men in dark suits entered the room, papers in hand, and the one leading them scanned the crowd before speaking in a voice that carried to every corner. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "We are here to find the sole heir to the Brooks Corporation. To understand how a single evening could unravel so completely, it helps to go back further, past the party, past the champagne, past the shattered watch on the marble floor, to the ordinary rhythm of a life nobody suspected concealed anything extraordinary at all." 6 months earlier, Amara Brooks had been nothing more than a quiet woman who arranged paintings for a living, working long hours at a small gallery on the east side of Manhattan, dusting frames and cataloging invoices under fluorescent lights that flickered when it rained. She lived in a rented studio apartment above a bakery, paid her bills 2 days early out of habit, and owned exactly one good coat for winter. Nobody in her life, not her coworkers, not her neighbors, and certainly not the man she loved, knew that her grandfather was one of the most private billionaires in the country, a man named Richard Brooks, who had built an empire in real estate, private equity, and quiet philanthropy, while staying almost entirely out of public view. Before he passed away that spring, Richard had taken his granddaughter's hands in his and given her the only piece of advice he ever repeated more than once. "Never fall in love with someone simply because they discover how much money you have," he told her, his voice thin but certain, "because a man who loves your bank account will never see the woman standing in front of him." Amara had promised him she understood, and she had spent years honoring that promise by living as if the fortune did not exist at all. When Richard Brooks died, his attorney, a composed and careful man named Jonathan Brooks, no relation by blood, but trusted like family for 3 decades, asked Amara to keep the matter of the inheritance private for several weeks while the estate was formally processed. There were signatures to gather, valuations to confirm, foundations to notify, and Jonathan wanted no chaos to touch Amara while she was still grieving. She agreed without hesitation, relieved in some strange way to have a few more weeks of ordinary life before the world learned who she truly was. During those same weeks, her boyfriend of 2 years, a sharp and ambitious young entrepreneur named Ethan Carter, was consumed with planning his own 33rd birthday celebration, an event he intended as both a party and a public announcement of his company's expansion into 2 new international markets. Ethan had built his firm from a modest consulting practice into a recognized name in finance technology, and he wore his success the way some men wear cologne, thick, unmistakable, and applied a little too generously in every room he entered. Ethan had also invited Vanessa Hale, a woman from his past who had reappeared in his professional circle over the previous few months under the pretense of a business partnership. Vanessa came from old money, the kind that funded galas and had wings of hospitals named after grandparents, and she had never fully accepted that Ethan chose someone like Amara after their own relationship ended years earlier. At every gathering leading up to the party, Vanessa found small, precise ways to remind everyone present that Amara did not belong among them, commenting on the modest cut of her dress, the age of her handbag, the fact that she took the subway instead of a car service. Ethan laughed along more often than he should have, telling himself it was harmless teasing between old friends, never once noticing how his silence in those moments landed on the woman beside him, like a slow, accumulating weight. Amara noticed everything, but she said nothing, because she had learned long ago that some battles are not worth fighting with words, and because she still believed, foolishly perhaps, that the man she loved would eventually choose to stand beside her instead of beside his own comfort. On the night of the party, she dressed simply, wrapped a small gift she had spent weeks restoring by hand, and walked into the lobby of the hotel, telling herself that love did not require expensive proof. She had thought, more than once that week, about telling Ethan everything before the party even began, about sitting him down quietly and explaining the fortune waiting behind her ordinary life, but something in her kept holding back, some instinct that whispered it was better to wait and watch, to see whether the man she loved would still choose her when there was nothing grand attached to the choosing. The ballroom that evening had been transformed into something out of a glossy magazine spread, chandeliers dimmed to a warm gold, ice sculptures melting slowly beside towers of champagne glasses, and a string quartet playing just loud enough to be elegant without interrupting conversation. The guest list read like a registry of the city's ambitious and arrived chief executives in tailored suits, minor celebrities, trailing photographers, venture capitalists, comparing portfolio returns between bites of seared scallop. Ethan moved through the crowd like a man born to be admired, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, positioning himself beneath the best lighting without seeming to try. Vanessa stayed close to him all evening, her hand finding his forearm at every opportunity, her laughter a fraction too loud whenever cameras turned in their direction. Amara stood near the edges of the room, polite but unremarkable in her simplicity, watching the woman she used to trust her boyfriend around orbit him like she had never left at all. Waiters circled with trays of appetizers arranged like small sculptures. A jazz singer took the stage between sets of the string quartet, and somewhere near the bar, a cluster of investors debated market projections loudly enough to be overheard, none of them noticing the quiet woman in gray, who moved through their midst almost invisibly, the way she had learned to move through rooms like this one for years, present but never quite seen. It was Vanessa who first raised the question loudly enough for a cluster of guests to hear, asking with theatrical curiosity what on earth Amara could have possibly bought for a man who already owned everything. The question rippled outward, heads turning, conversations pausing, until someone near the gift table suggested, half joking, that Ethan open his presents, in front of everyone, the way he always did at these events. Ethan, flushed with champagne and the easy confidence of being the center of attention, agreed immediately, calling for quiet as he began unwrapping gifts one by one. There were designer watches, a set of cufflinks flown in from Switzerland, a weekend getaway package to a private island, each gift met with appreciative applause and Ethan's practiced smile. When he reached Amara's box, small and plainly wrapped in brown paper, tied with simple string, the room's energy shifted, curiosity turning faintly cruel. Inside was an antique pocket watch that had belonged to Amara's late father, one she had spent 3 months and nearly every spare dollar restoring at a small horologist's shop downtown, its case polished until it gleamed, its mechanism repaired to keep perfect time again. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, his expression sliding from confusion into visible disappointment, and Vanessa's laughter cut through the silence like a blade finding its mark. That laughter seemed to unlock something reckless in Ethan, a need to reclaim the room's admiration by any means necessary, and he made the decision that would define the rest of his life within the span of a single breath. He raised the pocket watch above his head for the entire ballroom to see, his voice rising with theatrical outrage as he asked whether this was truly the best Amara could offer him, a second-hand watch that looked like it belonged in a pawn shop window. He compared her openly to Vanessa, listing the designers Vanessa wore, the family name she carried, the polish she brought to every room she entered, as if Amara were a disappointing investment rather than a woman he claimed to love. He told her, loud enough for the string quartet to fall silent, that she embarrassed him, that she had never truly fit into his world, and that perhaps it was time she understood exactly where she stood among his real friends. Then he let the watch fall from his hand, and it struck the marble floor with a sound sharper than it should have made, its glass face splitting into a spider web of cracks. 2 security guards, summoned by a glance from Ethan, moved toward Amara with the practiced neutrality of men paid not to ask questions. ready to walk her out of a party she had never wanted glamour from in the first place. Several guests filmed the moment on their phones without lowering their voices, some laughing along with Ethan, others going quiet with the particular discomfort of witnessing cruelty. They lacked the courage to interrupt. A few tried, weakly, to change the subject, murmuring that perhaps it was time for the band to play something livelier, but their voices were swallowed by the momentum of the room, by the strange gravitational pull cruelty exerts, once it has an audience willing to laugh along with it. Vanessa stood close to Ethan throughout, her expression carefully arranged into something between amusement and pity, occasionally leaning toward the guests nearest her to whisper a comment that made them laugh harder, feeding the spectacle exactly the way she had hoped it might unfold when she first raised the question of the gift. Amara knelt slowly and picked up the broken watch from the floor, cradling it in both palms as if it were still whole, and when she rose, she looked at Ethan for what felt like a very long time. "I understand now," she said, her voice even and unhurried, carrying none of the anger the room seemed to expect from her. She did not explain what exactly she understood, did not raise her voice to match his, did not offer the tearful scene that would have let everyone feel satisfied and move on. She simply turned, walked past the security guards, who suddenly seemed unsure whether their assistance was still required, and crossed the length of the ballroom alone, while 200 pairs of eyes followed her. As she reached the towering doors at the far end of the room, they began to open before she touched them, swinging outward, as if the building itself had been waiting for this exact moment. Beyond the threshold, a line of Blacktown cars idled at the curb outside the hotel, their engines humming low in the cool autumn night, and from the nearest vehicle stepped a group of men in dark, precisely tailored suits. The man leading them was Jonathan Brooks, silver-haired and composed, carrying himself with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent decades in rooms far more consequential than this one. He entered the ballroom flanked by 3 associates, each holding leather folios, their expressions professionally unreadable as they scanned the crowd for a single face. "Excuse the interruption," Jonathan said, his voice measured but impossible to ignore. "We are looking for a woman named Amara Brooks." A murmur swept through the guests, confusion replacing the earlier amusement, as several people glanced toward the doorway where Amara had just been standing moments before. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, some old instinct for control, asserting itself even now, and asked what business a team of lawyers could possibly have at his birthday party. Jonathan turned to look at him directly, and something in his gaze made Ethan's confident posture falter for the first time all evening. "Did you just have that young woman removed from this room?" Jonathan asked, and the question landed with a weight that silenced every remaining whisper. Ethan, still not fully understanding the gravity of what was unfolding, explained with a dismissive shrug that his girlfriend had embarrassed him with an inappropriate gift and that she had simply been asked to leave. Jonathan's expression did not change, but his voice dropped into something colder and more deliberate as he informed the room that the man they had just watched publicly humiliate a woman had, without knowing it, insulted someone whose personal fortune exceeded the entire value of Ethan's company several times over. A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd, phones lowering, conversations dying entirely, as people began exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether they had misheard. Vanessa, who had been standing close to Ethan all evening basking in the spectacle, felt the color drain slowly from her face as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape she did not want to see. Jonathan opened the leather folio in his hands and withdrew a single document bearing an official seal, holding it up so that anyone close enough could see the name printed clearly at its center. That name was Amara Brooks, and Jonathan explained, in the same steady voice he might use to read a weather report, that Richard Brooks, one of the wealthiest and most private men in American finance, had passed away recently, leaving behind exactly one heir. A woman near the bar dropped her glass, the sound of shattering crystal barely registering against the ringing silence that had fallen over the entire ballroom, and nobody moved to clean it up. Jonathan continued speaking into the stunned silence, laying out details that landed on the crowd like individual blows, each one heavier than the last. Richard Brooks had built an empire spanning commercial real estate across 4 continents, controlling interests in over a dozen private equity funds, a foundation that had quietly funded hospitals and universities for 30 years, and a personal art collection valued in the hundreds of millions housed partly in a museum that bore the family name. The total estate, Jonathan explained, was valued conservatively at several tens of billions of dollars, and every share of it, every property, every fund, every seat on every board, now belonged to a single woman who had, until this moment, chosen to live as though none of it existed. He explained that Amara had requested privacy in the weeks following her grandfather's death, not out of secrecy or deception, but out of grief and a desire to be certain the people around her valued her for who she was rather than what she owned. The gathered guests began to understand, with a slow and sickening clarity, exactly what they had witnessed only minutes earlier, and exactly whose humiliation they had laughed along with. Ethan stood frozen in the center of the room, the shattered watch still lying where it had fallen, his mind refusing to fully accept what his ears had just heard. Vanessa took a single step backward, as though putting physical distance between herself and the moment might somehow undo it. Jonathan produced the will itself from his folio, its pages thick with legal language, but its central clause unmistakable, even to those without legal training, naming Amara Brooks as the sole and unconditional heir to the entirety of the Brooks estate. He informed the room, almost as an afterthought, that he had come to this address specifically because Amara's phone had gone unanswered for several hours, and her assistant at the gallery had mentioned she planned to attend a birthday celebration that evening. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone present, that the very party meant to celebrate one man's rising fortune had become the exact place and moment. His fortune, by comparison, was revealed as almost trivial. Several guests who had laughed loudest during the humiliation now found sudden and urgent reasons to check their phones, to step toward the bar, to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. Ethan finally found his voice, asking in a near whisper whether this was some kind of mistake, some case of mistaken identity that could still be corrected. Jonathan closed the folio with a quiet final click and told him there was no mistake, that he should perhaps consider, before speaking to anyone else that evening, what exactly he had just done to the woman he claimed to love. It took Ethan nearly 11 minutes to push through the stunned crowd and reach the street outside, his mind cycling through disbelief, panic, and a dawning, nauseating shame he had never experienced in his adult life. He called Amara's phone 7 times before the calls stopped connecting at all, each unanswered ring feeling like confirmation of something he was not yet ready to name. He drove to her apartment above the bakery, buzzing the intercom, until a neighbor leaned out a window and told him she had not seen Amara return home that evening. He went to the gallery the next morning, arriving before opening hours and waiting on the sidewalk until a coworker unlocked the door, only to be told, with visible discomfort, that Amara had submitted her resignation by email sometime after midnight. He asked whether anyone knew where she had gone, whether she had family nearby, whether there was any address, any number, any thread he could still pull. And each time the coworker shook her head, offering only a wary, uncertain glance that made it clear news of the party had already reached the gallery before he arrived. Standing in the gallery's quiet entryway, surrounded by paintings Amara used to describe to him with quiet enthusiasm he had rarely bothered to listen to, Ethan began remembering details he had never allowed himself to notice before. She had never once asked him for money, had always insisted on paying her share, even when it strained her modest salary, had never mentioned her family beyond a grandfather she clearly adored but rarely elaborated on. He realized, standing in that empty gallery with morning light falling across abandoned canvases, that in 2 years together he had never once asked her a genuine question about who she truly was. He remembered the evenings. She came home exhausted from work, and he had barely looked up from his own phone to greet her. The birthdays where she remembered every small detail of his preferences, while he struggled to recall the name of the street where she grew up, the quiet, patient way she had loved him, without ever once asking for anything larger than his attention in return. None of it had seemed significant at the time, the way water does not seem significant until the day it is gone, and a person finally understands how much of their life depended on it. Jonathan Brooks refused every attempt Ethan made to reach him in the days that followed, declining calls, ignoring messages left with his office, turning away a courier Ethan sent with a handwritten letter. The silence was its own answer, a professional and deliberate wall erected around a woman who clearly wanted no further contact with the world she had briefly, painfully rejoined. In the absence of any response, Ethan found himself piecing together fragments of Amara's past from second-hand sources, old acquaintances, a mutual friend who had once met her grandfather briefly at a charity dinner years earlier without knowing the family name at the time. Slowly, a fuller picture emerged of the woman he thought he had known, a picture far richer and more deliberate than anything he had imagined. Richard Brooks, it turned out, had raised Amara after her parents passed away when she was young, and he had been fiercely protective of her ability to form her own identity separate from his fortune. He enrolled her in ordinary schools under a slightly altered surname arrangement handled quietly through the family's legal team, insisted she work summer jobs like any other teenager, and made her promise, repeatedly, that she would build a life measured by character rather than inheritance. He used to tell her, on quiet evenings at the kitchen table of the house where she grew up, that money could buy almost anything except the certainty that someone loved the person underneath it. And that certainty, he insisted, was worth more than every account statement bearing the family name combined. Amara had taken that, end quote, to save carefully for things other people simply purchased without thought. What almost no one at the party could have known, and what Ethan would only learn much later through a mutual acquaintance who had briefly worked at the Brooks Foundation, was that Amara had been planning to reveal everything to Ethan shortly after his birthday celebration concluded. She had told a close friend, weeks earlier, that she intended to sit him down once the party noise settled and finally explain the truth of who she was and where she came from, hoping he would understand why she had waited so long to share it. She had wanted, more than anything, to know that the 2 years they spent together had been built on something real, on affection for her, exactly as she appeared, rather than admiration for a fortune she had not yet claimed. She had even rehearsed the conversation in her mind, imagining how she might begin, imagining the look on his face when he understood, and in every version of that imagined evening, he took her hands and told her none of it changed anything at all, that he had already known everything he needed to know. The pocket watch she brought that night, restored so carefully over 3 months of evenings spent at a small horologist's workbench, had been intended as a symbol of exactly that kind of love, patient, personal, and unhurried by wealth. Instead, it lay shattered on a ballroom floor, and whatever trust Amara had been building toward sharing her full self with Ethan shattered along with it in that single, humiliating moment. By the time Ethan understood any of this, the woman capable of forgiving it had already walked out a set of glass doors and into a life that no longer had room for him in it. A letter arrived at Ethan's office roughly 2 weeks after the party, hand-delivered by a courier who left without waiting for a response, its envelope bearing no return address, but Amara's unmistakable, careful handwriting across the front. Inside, in a few short paragraphs, Amara explained what had actually wounded her that night, and it was not, as Ethan had assumed in his more self-pitying moments, the insult about the watch itself. What hurt, she wrote, was not that you disliked my gift, because gifts are small things, and hearts are not required to love every object placed in front of them. What hurt was that you let 200 strangers decide my worth for you, that you needed their laughter to know how to feel about me, that in the moment it mattered most, you chose their approval over understanding who I actually was. She wrote that she had spent her entire life being taught to value character over money, and that watching him abandon her for the sake of appearances confirmed something she had feared but never wanted to believe about him. Ethan read the letter standing in his office doorway, and by the time he finished it, his hands were trembling badly enough that he had to sit down on the floor, the paper still clutched against his chest. He read it again that night, and again the following morning, until the words no longer felt like sentences on a page, but like a mirror held up to every choice he had made in that ballroom. A mirror he could not look away from, no matter how badly he wanted to. The consequences beyond his personal grief arrived quickly and mercilessly. As footage from the party, filmed by multiple guests that night, began circulating widely within days, stitched together from different angles to show the full, ugly arc of the humiliation. Business partners who had once competed for Ethan's attention began finding reasons to postpone meetings, then to cancel contracts outright, citing concerns about brand reputation and public perception that they never fully spelled out but everyone understood clearly enough. Two major investors withdrew their commitments to the international expansion Ethan had planned to announce at the very party where everything unraveled, and without their capital, the expansion collapsed before it ever truly began. His own board of directors, uneasy about the mounting public criticism attached to his name, called an emergency meeting within the month to discuss his continued leadership of the company he had built from nothing. Vanessa, sensing the direction the wind was turning, distanced herself from Ethan almost immediately, issuing a brief statement through a publicist, describing herself as merely an old friend, uninvolved in the evening's unfortunate events. Ethan found himself, within the span of a single season, losing the company, the reputation, and the woman that together had once made up the entire architecture of his identity. Old friends stopped returning his calls. Invitations to the events he once organized himself dried up entirely, and for the first time in his adult life he understood, from the inside, the particular loneliness of a room emptying out once it decides a person is no longer useful to be seen beside. It was nearly 4 months later, on a cold afternoon in early winter, that Amara agreed to appear publicly for the first time since the party, at the opening of a new education wing, funded by the Brooks Foundation, in a modest neighborhood on the city's edge. She stood at a podium in a dark blue coat, composed and unhurried, speaking briefly about her grandfather's belief that opportunity should never depend on the accident of where a person was born. She took no questions about the party, about Ethan, or about the viral footage that had turned her, briefly, into a symbol for something larger than herself, deflecting every attempt with the same calm patience she had shown while walking out of that ballroom months earlier. Ethan attended the event uninvited, standing near the back of the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, and waited until the formal remarks concluded before approaching her as she prepared to leave. He did not ask for forgiveness in front of anyone, did not stage a dramatic public apology, the way another man might have hoped would restore his reputation. He simply asked, quietly and without an audience this time, whether she might give him 5 minutes to say what he should have said months earlier. Amara agreed, more out of a desire for closure than any renewed hope, and the two of them walked a short distance to a small park nearby, their breath visible in the cold afternoon air. Ethan told her without excuses that he had spent the previous months replaying that night in his mind more times than he could count, and that he understood now, far too late, that his cruelty had never really been about a watch at all. He said he had been ashamed, not of her, but of some manufactured version of status he had built his entire identity around, and that when the room laughed, some broken part of him had needed to laugh along, rather than risk being laughed at instead. He told her he loved her, that he had loved her before he knew about the fortune and still loved her now that everyone else only wanted access to it, and that he was asking not for the money or the status, but simply for the chance to prove he could be different. Amara listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the way it had been the night of the party, and when he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment before she finally responded. If I had walked into that ballroom still just the ordinary woman from the gallery, she asked him, with no fortune waiting behind me, and no lawyers arriving to prove my worth, would you be standing here apologizing to me right now? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, and found, to his own quiet devastation, that no honest answer would come. Amara did not wait for him to find the words, because she already understood, better than he did, exactly what his silence meant. She told him, gently but without any softening of the truth, that real love does not require proof of a person's importance before it decides they are worth protecting, and that whatever they had shared, however genuine parts of it may have felt, had never quite passed that test. She thanked him for the years they spent together, told him she wished him a life built on something steadier than other people's applause, and then she turned and walked toward a waiting car at the edge of the park. Ethan stood alone among the bare winter trees, watching the car pull away and merge into the flow of traffic until it disappeared entirely from view, understanding at last that some doors, once closed, are not meant to reopen, no matter how sincerely a person knocks. He returned to what remained of his company with a different kind of resolve, no longer chasing the version of success measured in headlines and envy, but he did so alone, carrying the particular weight of a lesson learned only after it was too late to change its outcome. A full year passed, and the city around both of them continued its restless motion, indifferent to the private reckonings unfolding within it. Amara had, by then, formally accepted her role as chair of the Brooks Foundation, a position she approached with the same quiet discipline she had once brought to arranging paintings in a small gallery, only now applied across a far larger canvas. Under her direction, the foundation expanded its education initiatives into 11 additional cities, funded scholarship programs for young artists who reminded her, in small ways, of the girl she used to be before any of this began, and restructured its museum holdings to make the family's private collection freely accessible to the public for the first time in its history. She personally reviewed hundreds of scholarship applications each year, insisting on reading the essays herself rather than delegating the task entirely to committee, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be a young person with talent and no clear path toward using it, and she wanted every applicant to know that someone with the power to change their circumstances had actually taken the time to see them. The corporation itself, once managed at arm's length by boards and executives Richard Brooks had trusted, found new energy and direction under Amara's careful, deliberate leadership, growing steadily, even as she insisted on maintaining the same modest personal habits that had defined her life before the inheritance. She still preferred small apartments to sprawling estates, still walked when the weather allowed it, still spoke to employees at every level of her companies with the same unhurried attentiveness she had once given to visitors browsing the gallery. Wealth, it turned out, had not changed who she was, because she had already decided, long before any of it arrived, exactly who she intended to be. Colleagues who worked alongside her often remarked that she still remembered the names of interns after a single introduction, still stayed late to help a struggling employee finish a report rather than delegate the task downward, still treated the janitor, who cleaned the foundation's offices each evening, with the same warmth she extended to visiting diplomats and museum donors alike. It was, several of them agreed privately, as though the money had simply confirmed a character that already existed, rather than manufacturing one that had not been there before. Ethan's path unfolded very differently over that same year, marked by a slow, deliberate dismantling of the life he had built around appearances. He sold his remaining stake in the company within 8 months, unable to continue leading an organization whose reputation had become permanently entangled with a single cruel evening no rebranding effort could fully erase. He stepped away from the social circles that had once defined his sense of importance, the galas, the private clubs, the constant performance of success for an audience that, he now understood, had never actually cared about him personally at all. He took a smaller role at a firm outside the city, one where nobody recognized his name from viral footage, and he spent those months in a kind of deliberate, quiet, trying to understand who he might have become, if status had never been available to him as a substitute for genuine character. He kept the broken pocket watch in a drawer of his desk, never repaired, never discarded, a small and deliberate reminder of the exact moment he had chosen, an audience's laughter over the quiet, steady love standing right in front of him. It was not redemption exactly, not the kind that erases what came before, but it was a beginning, the slow and unglamorous work of a man learning, far too late for it to matter to the person who deserved it most, what it actually meant to value someone without conditions attached. He began volunteering on weekends at a community center near his new apartment, not for recognition, since almost nobody there knew his name or his history, but because the quiet, unremarkable work of simply showing up for people who needed nothing from his reputation felt, for the first time in years, like something honest. The seasons turned slowly over that year, autumn folding into a long winter, winter thawing eventually into the tentative green of early spring, and with each passing month the memory of that ballroom grew fainter for most of the people who had once stood inside it, filed away as an amusing piece of gossip rather than a turning point in two lives. Their paths crossed again, unexpectedly, at an art exhibition opening in the spring. One of the smaller galleries, Amara's foundation, now quietly supported alongside its larger institutional grants. Ethan had come at the invitation of a former colleague, unaware Amara would be present until he saw her across the room, standing before a painting with the same quiet stillness she used to bring to her old job, cataloging invoices under flickering lights. She noticed him a moment later, and something passed between them that was neither warmth nor hostility, but something closer to recognition, the particular acknowledgement two people share when they have both survived the same difficult chapter and emerged as different people entirely. There was no scene, no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reconciliation of the kind that might satisfy an audience hoping for a tidy ending. Amara offered him a small, polite smile, the kind extended to any acquaintance from a previous life, and Ethan returned it with something quieter, something that carried no expectation attached to it at all. Neither of them approached the other beyond that brief exchange of glances, and after a few moments, Amara turned back toward the paintings on the wall, continuing her slow walk through the gallery, as though the encounter had settled something long unresolved between them. She did not choose reconciliation that evening, and she did not choose bitterness either, because both would have required her to remain tethered to a version of herself defined by what Ethan had done rather than by who she had decided to become in its aftermath. She chose instead to keep walking, past the paintings, past the small crowd gathered near the entrance, out into the mild evening air, where a car waited to take her toward whatever came next in a life she was still, deliberately and carefully, building on her own terms. What remained afterward was not a story of revenge, nor a fairy tale ending stitched together for easy comfort, but something quieter and more enduring, a reminder carried forward by everyone who had witnessed even a fragment of what happened that autumn evening. The true measure of wealth, it turned out, was never the number printed on a balance sheet or the address listed on a deed, but something far simpler and far harder to fake. It was the way a person chose to treat someone standing in front of them before they knew anything at all about who that person might one day become. And it was that lesson, more than any inheritance or empire, that outlasted every guest who had once laughed inside that glittering, forgotten ballroom. Years afterward, when people recalled the story at all, they rarely remembered the exact sum of the fortune or the name of the company Ethan once ran, but they remembered, almost without fail, the image of a woman in a simple gray dress, bending down to pick up a broken watch without a single tear, and walking away with her dignity fully intact. That image, more than any headline or courtroom document, became the true inheritance she left behind, passed quietly from one listener to the next. A reminder that grace under cruelty is its own kind of fortune, one that can never be seized, divided, or taken away by anyone who fails to recognize its worth until it has already walked out the door.